I want to tell you something before I start. I've seen a lot of strange things in my 23 years working aboard a Galactic Coalition medical station. I've watched species from 40 different worlds go through procedures that would make most humans pass out just from the description. I've seen gill surgery on a Velthari warrior who was still conscious and singing. I've watched a Korathi healer dissolve a bone infection by pressing 2 fingers against the patient's skin for 6 hours straight, just standing there, eyes closed, humming something low and repetitive. I've seen a lot, but nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what Sergeant Marcus Hale did on the afternoon of the 3rd rotation in the Drevari cluster. Nothing, and I need to tell you this story because I think people deserve to know, not just the medical records version, not the official Coalition incident report that describes the whole thing in 3 dry sentences and calls it a non-standard field intervention. I mean the real version. The version where you could smell the disinfectant and the blood and feel the weight of every second hanging in that corridor. Let me take you back. The Helix Station, formerly designated Medical Outpost Helix 9, but nobody ever called it that, sat at the edge of the Drevari cluster like a silver seed floating in dark water. It was one of 17 Coalition medical stations scattered across the Outer Rim territories, and in terms of prestige and resources, we were somewhere in the middle of the pack. Not the best, not the worst. We had 3 fully equipped surgical theaters. We had a staff of about 260 beings representing 31 different species. We had the best diagnostic array in a 4-light-year radius, a Sorrow-class regeneration tank that could knit bone back together in under 6 hours, and a chief medical officer who was a Velkari named Physician Soren Ethis, the kind of being who walked into a room and immediately made every other person feel slightly less intelligent. Soren was brilliant. Cold, methodical, brilliant. She had 4 eyes, 2 of which could see into ultraviolet, and she used all of them when she was working. She didn't like uncertainty. She especially didn't like humans. I should note, that last part isn't unusual. A lot of species in the Coalition have complicated feelings about humans. It's not always hostility. Sometimes it's just discomfort. Humans are loud. Humans take up more emotional space than their physical size seems to justify. Humans ask too many questions and then don't wait for the answers. Humans do things that don't make sense within any known framework of rational behavior. Soren found all of this profoundly exhausting. She said so out loud often. The human nervous system, she told me once, completely unprompted, while we were both eating in the station cafeteria, appears to generate more chemical stress responses in a single standard day than most species experience in a full lunar cycle. I don't understand how they function. I don't understand how they want to function. It seems genuinely unpleasant. I nodded and kept eating my protein block. I'm human myself. I work as a xenobiology research assistant at Helix 9. My name is Dr. Priya Vasanthakumar, and I have been on this station long enough to know that Soren's comments, while blunt, weren't meant as insults. They were just observations, from someone who genuinely couldn't comprehend why a being would voluntarily subject themselves to that much physiological noise. Fair enough. I'd been working alongside physician Soren Ethis and the rest of the Helix 9 medical staff for 4 years when all of this happened. 4 years of watching surgical procedures, logging alien biological data, cataloging new diseases, sitting in on consultations. I knew the rhythms of that station better than I knew my own face. And the one thing I knew more than anything else was this. When something went wrong on Helix 9, the system handled it. There was a protocol for everything. Every injury, every emergency, every unexpected biological event, there was a protocol. Physician Soren had designed most of them herself. She was fanatically detail-oriented. She ran 3 safety drills per month. She personally reviewed every surgical outcome and filed a review within 24 hours. She knew every piece of equipment in every theater, where it was, what it did, and what its failure threshold was. The system worked. That was the point of the system. It worked because Soren made sure it worked. Which is why what happened on that 3rd rotation was so shocking to everyone on the station. The system failed. Not catastrophically, not in a way that killed anyone, but it failed. And in the gap left by that failure, in the precise, narrow, terrifying gap between the moment everything went wrong and the moment the protocols could catch up, a human being named Marcus Hale stepped in. And he did something that nobody on that station, not Soren, not the senior surgical team, not the coalition-certified emergency specialists, had ever seen done outside of a historical archive. Let me tell you about Marcus first. Sergeant Marcus Hale was 38 years old, which on Helix 9 made him middle-aged by human standards and absolutely ancient by the reckoning of several of the shorter-lived species on staff. The Yavari nurses, for instance, had a natural lifespan of about 22 years, and they looked at Marcus sometimes with an expression I can only describe as reverent bewilderment, the way you might look at a very old and very weathered tree that was somehow still standing. He wasn't a doctor. Let me be absolutely clear about that up front. He wasn't even medical staff. Marcus Hale was our security sergeant, the head of the station's 14-person security detail, responsible for access control, conflict resolution, escort procedures, and on the rare occasions when things got genuinely dangerous, threat response. He was a compact man, not short, maybe 1.82 meters, but built in a way that seemed very deliberately efficient, like he'd been assembled with a specific purpose in mind, and nothing had been included that didn't serve that purpose. He had close-cropped dark hair going gray at the temples, a jaw that could have been carved from local asteroid stone, and eyes so dark they were almost black. He was quiet. I mean that in a specific way. There are people who are quiet because they have nothing to say. There are people who are quiet because they're shy. Marcus was quiet the way deep water is quiet. There was a lot happening underneath. You just had to look carefully to notice it. He'd been on Helix 9 for 2 years before the incident. I knew him reasonably well, the way you know someone when you work in the same pressurized tube of metal and recycled air for long enough. We'd eaten in the cafeteria together dozens of times. I knew he took his coffee, real ground coffee. He'd brought a 6-month supply from Earth and rationed it like it was medicine, without anything added. I knew he read paper books, actual physical paper books, which he'd somehow accumulated a small collection of and kept in his quarters in a repurposed equipment case. I knew he sent a voice message home to his daughter every single night of every week, and that her name was Lena, and that she was 9 years old and obsessed with fish. I knew he'd been a combat medic before he transitioned to security work. He'd mentioned it once, very briefly, during a conversation about field work. He said he'd trained with the Earth Defense Corps for 6 years, done 2 tours as a combat medic in the orbital border disputes back in '71, and then had moved into security because, and this was the exact phrasing he used, I got tired of fixing things that kept getting broken on purpose. He'd said it without bitterness, just as a fact. I'd filed that information away in the back of my mind, the way you file things you don't know the use of yet. Old combat medic. Security sergeant, knows how to fix things. I did not understand at the time exactly what that meant. The incident began at 14:22 station time, on what had been, up to that moment, a perfectly unremarkable Tuesday. I was in the xenobiology lab on level 3, running a cell culture analysis on a sample from a Keth patient who'd come in 2 days ago with an unusual tissue hardening condition. The Keth are a silicon-adjacent species. Their cellular matrix incorporates silica compounds in ways that give them extraordinary durability, but occasionally cause crystallization events in their secondary organs, which is about as unpleasant as it sounds. I was running comparison models against the 14 previous cases we'd documented. The alert came through at 14:22:07. It wasn't the red alert. The red alert is the serious one, the loud, pulsing all-hands emergency signal. What came through was the yellow cascade alert, which means situation developing, standby for escalation. Yellow alerts happened a few times a month, usually a patient with unexpected complications or a cargo delivery with contamination concerns. They almost never became red alerts. I saved my work, closed the culture samples, and opened the station's internal monitoring feed on my tablet, standard practice when a yellow alert comes in. I wasn't needed, just wanted to know what was happening. The feed showed me the emergency bay on level 2. And even from my small tablet screen, even through the slightly grainy internal camera, I could see that this was going to be different. The patient was a Galvari officer, military. Senior rank, I could tell from the rank insignia even through the screen, 3 gold bands and a crimson bar on his shoulder plate, which in Galvari military culture meant something like a colonel or a sector commander. His name, I learned later, was Commander Thresh Veloth. He was the commanding officer of the CGS Ironhillow, a Galvari patrol cruiser that had docked with Helix 9 about 2 hours earlier for a scheduled maintenance stop and crew wellness check. Thresh Veloth was not well. The Galvari are a large species, bipedal, but averaging 2.5 meters in height, with dense muscle structures and a calcium-reinforced exoskeletal layer over their vital organs. They look, to a human eye, somewhat like if you took a very large man and then added an extra layer of armor plating to his chest and shoulders, made from material that resembled dark amber. Heavy, solid, intimidating. Thresh Veloth had come in with what should have been a straightforward laceration. He'd been injured during a routine maintenance procedure on the ship. A piece of pressurized conduit had ruptured and caught him across the torso. The laceration ran from his lower left ribs across to his right hip, cutting through the amber exoskeletal plating and the soft tissue beneath. Here is the thing about Galvari biology that everyone on the station knew, but that became critically, urgently relevant in the next 30 minutes. The Galvari have a coagulation process unlike almost any other species in the known coalition. Their blood, a dark, almost black fluid called Velcerath, does not clot in the way most warm-blooded species' blood does. It doesn't form a fibrin mesh. Instead, it undergoes a process called mineral hardening, in which dissolved calcium compounds in the blood precipitate out and form a crystalline lattice over the wound site, essentially creating a calcium seal from the inside. This process is extraordinary. Under normal circumstances, it can stop even a significant wound from bleeding out in under 2 minutes. It is, for the Galvari, one of their most remarkable evolutionary adaptations. Under normal circumstances, what nobody knew when Thresh Veloth walked into the emergency bay, what the diagnostic systems didn't catch in the initial triage scan because they were looking for the obvious markers, was that Thresh Veloth was carrying a bloodstream condition called Velcerath Suppression Syndrome, or VSS. It's a rare Galvari condition in which the mineral hardening process is inhibited. The calcium compounds in the blood stop precipitating properly. The crystalline lattice doesn't form. With VSS, a Galvari bleeds like any other species. Continuously, without stopping. If you don't know they have it, and they haven't been told they have it, which Thresh Veloth apparently hadn't, because the VSS had likely been triggered recently by a nutrient deficiency in the patrol ship's food supply. Then you walk in thinking you're treating a straightforward laceration, and instead you find yourself watching a 2.5-meter coalition officer begin to bleed out on your emergency bay table. That's what happened at 1422. I watched through the feed as the yellow alert cascaded to orange at 1424. Orange means confirmed medical emergency, surgical team activating. Within 90 seconds of the orange alert, I could see the emergency bay filling with staff. 2 Velcari nurses, a Korathi surgical assistant, a human paramedic named Tors who was already reading the diagnostic display with an expression of increasing alarm, and arriving last, because she moved with a deliberateness that seemed to say, I am not panicking, and I am not going to start now, physician Soren Ethis. Soren assessed the situation in under 30 seconds. I know this because I know Soren, and I could read her body language even through a tablet screen. She stood very still for those 30 seconds, her 4 eyes moving across the patient, the diagnostic displays, the wound. Then she said something to Tors that I couldn't hear through the feed, and Tors nodded and began pushing a cart of equipment toward the surgical preparation area. Then Soren spoke into her comm. The orange alert shifted to red at 1426. All hands, full emergency activation. All off-duty surgical staff to report immediately. I put down my tablet and left the lab. By the time I reached the emergency level, the situation had already gotten worse. I know, looking back, that I should have stayed in the lab. I was a xenobiology researcher, not a medical professional in any hands-on sense. I had no business being in the emergency bay corridor during an active surgical crisis. But I think there's something in human beings. Maybe it's that same quality that Soren found so exhausting, that constant chemical noise, that pulls you toward the emergency rather than away from it. Some instinct that says, go see, go understand, be present. I went. The corridor outside the emergency bay was not crowded, but there were people there who had arrived the same way I had drawn by the red alert, not needed but unwilling to be elsewhere. Tors had positioned himself at the corridor junction and was managing traffic, directing people away from the bay doors with a series of efficient hand gestures that came from his years of emergency training. I found a spot near the wall out of the way, where I could see through the bay's observation window. What I saw inside was organized chaos. Organized because Soren was there. Chaotic because Commander Thresh-Veloth was losing blood at a rate that the diagnostic display above his table showed in unambiguous, bright, alarming red. His Velserath pressure, the Galvari equivalent of blood pressure, was dropping. The wound was not clotting. The mineral hardening process was not occurring. The dark, almost black Velserath was pooling on the table's surface and beginning to drip. The surgical team was moving fast, but they were running into a wall that I could see even from the corridor. The equipment wasn't cooperating. Helix 9 was equipped to handle Galvari patients. We had them come through regularly. The Galvari military routes passed through this sector, and we were the nearest coalition medical facility to two of their patrol corridors. We had calibrated equipment for their biology, their size, their tissue structure. What we did not have, what nobody had, because VSS was vanishingly rare and nobody had anticipated it, was the specific clotting agent formulation required for a Galvari patient whose mineral hardening process had been suppressed. The standard Galvari coagulant we kept in stock worked by triggering and accelerating the crystalline lattice formation. It assumed the process was present and just needed a push. In a VSS patient, there was no process to accelerate. The standard coagulant was useless. The synthetic alternatives, the coalition standard coagulants designed for non-crystalline biology, weren't calibrated for Galvari Velserath chemistry. They might help. They might cause a violent chemical reaction. Without running a full compatibility analysis, which would take a minimum of 40 minutes with the station's medical synthesizer, they couldn't know. 40 minutes. Thresh-Veloth had, by the display's estimate, maybe 22 minutes at his current blood loss rate before he reached a critical threshold. Soren knew this. I could see her standing at the side of the table, 4 eyes moving, working through the problem. The Velkari nurses were applying direct pressure to the wound with specialized clamps designed for Galvari tissue. But the wound was large, nearly 40 centimeters across, and the clamps were slowing the blood loss but not stopping it. The regeneration tank, our Sorrow class unit, the one that could knit bone in 6 hours, was being brought online. But it took 8 minutes to reach full operating temperature, and loading a patient Thresh-Veloth's size and mass into it without first stabilizing the wound would cause a pressure trauma that the system's own safety protocols would prevent. The surgical team needed a bridge. They needed to buy time, to stop or dramatically slow the bleeding for 30 minutes while the tank warmed, and the synthesizer ran the compatibility analysis. And they couldn't figure out how to do it. I watched Soren stand at that table, watching the display, and for the first time in 4 years, I saw her look uncertain. It lasted maybe 3 seconds. Then I heard a voice from the corridor beside me. "What's the mineral content of the wound site?" Marcus Hale. He'd come up beside me without my noticing, or maybe I'd noticed, and just hadn't registered it, because he moved quietly. The way people do when moving quietly is a skill they've practiced until it's automatic. He was in his security uniform, dark gray, with the Helix 9 insignia at the shoulder. He wasn't supposed to be in this corridor during a red alert. His protocols called for his team to secure the station perimeter while medical staff handled the emergency. But he was here. He was looking through the observation window, and his expression was different from everyone else's in the corridor. Everyone else was watching with anxiety, with that helpless feeling of witnessing something bad and not being able to stop it. Some of the junior staff had their hands pressed to their mouths. One of the Yavari nurses was making a soft, high-pitched sound of distress that was just at the edge of my hearing. Marcus was watching the way you watch something when you're working out a problem. Focused, almost clinical. His dark eyes moved across the bay, the patient, the equipment, the displays. "The mineral content," he said again, quietly, more to himself than to me. "Has anyone checked the local Velserath for calcium depletion?" "That's what VSS is," I said, because the words came out before I thought about them. "The calcium isn't precipitating. The crystalline lattice formation is suppressed." He looked at me. "Your vasanthacumer, Zenobio." "Yes. You know Galvari anatomy." Enough, I've cataloged 12 Galvari cases in the last 3 years. VSS is extremely rare. I've only seen it in the literature. But you know the mechanism. I know the mechanism. He looked back through the window. A moment passed. I could almost feel him thinking, not the anxious, recursive thinking of someone in a panic, but the methodical, sequential thinking of someone moving through a checklist. Okay, he said very quietly. Physical closure. I looked at him. What? Sutures, mechanical closure of the wound, standard earth field medicine. He said it like it was the most obvious thing in the world. If you can't stop the chemical process from inside, you close the wound mechanically from outside. Buy time. Basic combat medic protocol. I stared at him. And then, because I'm a researcher and my first instinct when I hear something unexpected is to process it rather than dismiss it, I thought about what he was actually saying. Sutures stitching the wound closed. It was so old, so fundamentally, primitively old. Helix 9 was equipped with a Sorrow-class regeneration tank, a molecular-level tissue synthesizer, a diagnostic array that could analyze 400 biological variables simultaneously. We had equipment that could close a wound with targeted sound waves, with precision laser arrays, with bioadhesive polymers calibrated to specific tissue types. But all of those systems assumed normal Galvari biology. All of those systems were either offline, incompatible, or running warm-up cycles. Sutures didn't assume anything about biology. Sutures were just thread, needle, mechanical closure. They worked by physics, not chemistry. They would work on a VSS patient. I think I actually laughed. Not from humor, from the kind of shocked, almost involuntary reaction your body has when a very simple solution appears to a very complicated problem. Galvari exoskeletal plating, I said. The wound goes through the plate, standard sutures won't. The plate is already compromised. The rupture cracked it. The soft tissue underneath is what's bleeding. He'd already worked through this. He'd worked through it while I was still processing. If the plate is fractured, I can work around it. I need the soft tissue sutured. Get me access to the emergency bay. I looked at him. This was a security sergeant asking me, a xenobiology researcher, to get him into an active surgical emergency so he could stitch a coalition commander with Earth-era sutures. You're not medical staff, I said. I was a combat medic for 6 years, he said. I've sutured worse than this. On humans. On whatever was in front of me. He met my eyes steadily. There was no bluster in it, no performance. He just meant it completely, and he needed me to understand that he meant it. I'm not going to walk in there and pretend to be a doctor. I'm going to walk in there and tell physician Soren Ethis what I can do and let her decide. But somebody needs to get me through that door because I don't have clearance, and we are running out of time. I stood there for 1 second. 1 full second, looking at this man. And then I turned around and pushed through the emergency bay door. Soren looked up when I came in. Her expression was precisely what you'd expect, 4 eyes narrowing in the Valkyrie expression that translates roughly as I would like you to explain yourself immediately, and I am not going to enjoy the explanation. Dr. Vasanthakumar, she said, with a kind of controlled sharpness that was worse than shouting. This is an active surgical emergency. You are not. Mechanical closure, I said. She stopped. Sutures, I said. Physical suture closure of the wound to buy time for the tank and the synthesizer. Marcus Hale is outside. He's a former combat medic, 6 years, Earth Defense Corps. He's done field suturing. He's asking for permission to attempt a mechanical bridge closure. Dead silence in the bay. Not because everyone stopped what they were doing. They kept working, kept managing the clamps and the monitoring equipment and the failing vital signs. But there was a quality of silence underneath all that movement, a stillness in the cognitive space of the room, as everyone registered what I'd said. Soren looked at me. She looked at the patient. She looked at the wound. She looked at the diagnostic display, showing 19 minutes remaining at current blood loss rate. The sutures, she said, can they hold against Galvari tissue tensile strength? I didn't know, but Marcus was already at the door. I looked at him through the observation window and he held up both hands, high tensile field sutures, the military grade ones. He says high tensile field sutures, military grade. Soren was quiet for 2 more seconds. 2 seconds is a long time when someone is bleeding. Send him in, she said, and someone get me a full Galvari tissue profile on the wound site, right now. Marcus Hale walked into that surgical bay with the same quiet, purposeful energy he brought to everything. He didn't hurry. He didn't project false confidence or perform competence. He just moved directly, efficiently toward the table. He looked at the wound for maybe 5 seconds. "Where's your suture kit?" he asked Soren. She pointed to a supply cabinet on the far wall. He went to it. I followed him in. Nobody stopped me, which I think speaks to how focused everyone was on the primary crisis. The suture kit in our emergency supplies was not designed for Galvari biology. It was a general-purpose surgical kit, coalition standard, equipped for multiple species. Marcus opened it, assessed the contents in about 3 seconds, and pulled out the heaviest gauge suture thread available, a polycomposite fiber rated for extreme tissue stress applications. "This is for Keth skeletal suturing," I said, recognizing the packaging. "Good. Strong enough?" He was already unwrapping it. "Does the Valkyrie anatomy overlap with human enough that I can use a curved needle, or do I need something else?" "The tissue layers are different. Galvari subcutaneous layer is about twice as dense as human. You need to go deeper." He looked at me. "Can you walk me through the tissue layers while I work?" I hesitated. "I know you're Zenobio, not surgery," he said. "I'm not asking you to make the calls. I just need someone who knows the anatomy to be my second set of eyes. Soren's managing the whole bay. You're the one who knows the tissue." I looked at the patient, at the dark pooling blood, at the diagnostic display. 17 minutes. "Okay," I said. "Yes." He nodded once, picked up the needle, and turned toward Commander Thresh Veloth. I am not going to pretend that what followed was easy to watch, or easy to participate in, even in the limited way that I did. It was not easy. It was one of the most intense things I have ever experienced, and I've been present for some things on this station that I still have trouble putting into words. The VSS incident, the time a Korathi patient went into neural cascade, and we had to manage a full secondary nervous system collapse, the year the Keth crystallization epidemic hit, and we had 47 patients in crisis simultaneously. I've seen things. But this was different. This was different because of what it was, because of the pure, raw, ancient simplicity of it. In a medical facility filled with the most advanced biological technology, the Coalition had developed over 300 years of interspecies medicine. In a surgical bay equipped with tools that most of human history couldn't have imagined, a man was stitching a wound shut. With thread and a needle and his hands. He worked with the focused, complete presence of someone who has done this under conditions worse than this and survived both the doing and the remembering. His hands were steady. I mean genuinely steady. I watched them, because I needed to watch them to read the tissue layers and tell him where to place the needle, and there was no tremor, no hesitation, just precise, deliberate motion. He spoke quietly as he worked. Not to the room, not performing for the assembled staff. Just to me, and sometimes to the patient, because he kept making small sounds in Commander Thresh Veloth's direction. Not words exactly, just acknowledgments. The way you might if you were working on someone you wanted to reassure even though they were sedated and couldn't hear you. I found out later that this was a habit Marcus had developed during his combat medic years. His unit's psychologist had told him that patients responded better to procedures even under sedation if the provider made sound. He'd kept doing it ever since, even knowing it was probably more for him than for them. I told him the tissue layers as we went. He adjusted. He asked questions, specific, clinical, practical questions that told me he was processing the Galvari anatomy in real time and mapping it onto the framework he already had. He wasn't pretending to know Galvari biology. He knew human biology and field medicine deeply, and he was extending that knowledge carefully, methodically, checking every assumption against what I told him. Soren moved to stand near us at some point. I didn't notice when she arrived. She watched for a while without saying anything. Then she said, very quietly, "The tension on the third suture, slightly less. The Galvari subcutaneous layer will redistribute. If you pull too tight, it will tear rather than hold." Marcus adjusted without comment. He didn't say thank you. She didn't seem to expect it. They just worked together, silently, the way people do when they're both focused entirely on the same thing. The blood loss rate on the diagnostic display began to drop. Not dramatically, not immediately. It was gradual, suture by suture, the closure slowly, mechanically reducing the wound aperture and the rate at which the Velserath could escape. But it dropped. And kept dropping. At suture 7, the display rate had halved. At suture 11, it had dropped to 30% of the initial rate. At suture 14, the final one, closing the last segment of the wound that Marcus could reach without compromising the cracked exoskeletal plate, it was at 12%. Not stopped, not healed. 12% of the original bleeding rate, which at Commander Thresh Veloth's blood volume and mass was survivable. More than survivable, manageable. Long enough for the tank to reach temperature, long enough for the synthesizer to complete its compatibility analysis, long enough to actually save his life. The regeneration tank reached full operating temperature at 14:59 station time. Commander Thresh Veloth was loaded into it at 15:02. He was stable. Marcus stepped back from the table. He stripped off the surgical gloves he'd borrowed from the supply cabinet and set them on the waste tray. He flexed his hands once, just once, and then he was still. The bay was very quiet. Not the silence of a crisis, the silence of a crisis that has just ended, which is a different thing entirely. The weight of it is different. The air feels different. Everyone in the room was breathing in a way they hadn't been breathing for the last 30-some minutes. Tors, who had come in at some point during the procedure, let out a breath that he seemed to have been holding for several minutes. One of the Velkari nurses made a low, harmonics-based sound that, in their culture, signifies something between "thank you" and "the danger is past." The Korathi surgical assistant turned away from the table and stood against the wall for a moment, alone with something. Soren stood looking at the regeneration tank. Then she turned and looked at Marcus Hale. I think I was holding my breath, waiting to see what she would say. Soren was not a being who handed out approval easily. She was not a being who acknowledged things she hadn't expected or hadn't planned for with anything other than clinical distance. I had seen her watch extraordinary things happen in this bay and respond with nothing more than a precise technical assessment. She looked at Marcus for a long time. Then she said, "Where did you learn the needle angle for deep tissue approximation?" Marcus blinked. It was not what he'd expected, I could tell. "Combat field training," he said. "Outer rim deployment. We worked with several species during the border disputes. I learned to adjust." "The suture pattern," Soren said. "The interrupted approximation technique. It's not standard coalition field protocol." "It's Earth field protocol," Marcus said. "Old, pre-coalition, but it distributes tension better across irregular wound margins, so we kept it." Soren was quiet. "The Galvari tissue tolerated it," Marcus said. "Better than I expected, actually. The density helps. The sutures had more to grip." "Yes," Soren said, "I noticed." Another silence. "Your former designation," Soren said. "Combat medic." "That's right. Human Earth Defense Corps. 6 years, 2 Tor." Soren looked at the regeneration tank, then back at him. "In my assessment," she said, and her voice had a quality I had never heard in it before, something that wasn't quite warmth, wasn't quite the Velkari equivalent of warmth, but was something adjacent, something that meant I have been surprised and I am choosing to acknowledge it. The decision to pursue mechanical closure was correct. The implementation was technically sound, and the outcome justifies the method. From physician Soren Ethis, that was approximately equivalent to a standing ovation. Marcus just nodded. Once he said, "Good." And then he went to the supply cabinet, disposed of the used materials, washed his hands thoroughly with the station's antiseptic system, and walked back toward the bay door. He paused at the door. "Let me know when he's out of the tank," he said to no one in particular. "I'd like to know he made it." Then he left. Commander Thresh Veloth came out of the regeneration tank 4 hours and 17 minutes later, which was faster than the projected 6 hours because the molecular tissue regeneration, once it had access to the stabilized wound site, could work more efficiently than anticipated. His VSS was documented, flagged in the Coalition Medical Registry, and a permanent notation was added to his medical file so that no future treatment would make the same initial error. He was groggy, disoriented, and in mild pain when he came out, all normal post-tank symptoms. He had no idea what had happened in the surgical bay while he was sedated. He was told. In the measured, precise way that Soren Ethis communicated everything, she sat with him in the recovery room and explained the sequence of events. The VSS diagnosis, the equipment constraints, the blood loss timeline, the suture procedure. When she finished, Commander Thresh-Veloth was quiet for a very long time. The Galvari, as a culture, have a complex relationship with what they call blood debt, the concept of an obligation created by someone saving your life. It's not precisely the same as the human concept. It's more formal, more binding in a cultural sense. Among Galvari military personnel especially, it carries significant weight. Thresh-Veloth asked who had performed the procedure. Soren told him, a human security sergeant named Marcus Hale, using earth field medicine techniques. Thresh-Veloth didn't say anything to this, but he asked to speak with Marcus directly. I know this happened because I was still in the recovery area, helping with some of the documentation. Someone had to catalog the VSS case for the xenobiology records, and that was my job even if everything else that had happened wasn't. I was at a console in the corner when Soren arranged for Marcus to come down. Marcus arrived in the recovery room looking like a man who had been recalled to duty during his off hours and wasn't entirely sure why. He was still in his security uniform, the jacket a little less precisely pressed than usual. He stood near the doorway. Thresh-Veloth looked at him from the recovery bed. The Galvari commander was even more imposing lying down than most people are standing up. Even post-surgery, post-tank, with the amber exoskeletal plating cracked along his torso, and the skin beneath wrapped in the station's medical dressing, he radiated the quiet authority of someone who had spent decades being the largest and most dangerous presence in any given room. He looked at Marcus for a long moment. You use thread, he said. His standard was precise, carefully formal. To close my wound. Yes, sir, Marcus said. Thread and a needle. Yes. Your people's medicine. One of our older techniques, Marcus said. We've had it for about 4,000 years, doesn't require power or calibration. Works when everything else doesn't. Thresh-Veloth was quiet. He looked down at his bandaged torso, then back at Marcus. My people, he said slowly, have been coalition members for 160 years. In that time I have served on 17 ships. I have been treated by coalition medical staff 11 times. He paused. I have never been treated with thread. Marcus didn't say anything. There wasn't a good response to that, so he just waited. Our physicians, Thresh-Veloth continued, were ready to operate. They had a plan. They were working through it. They were, Marcus said. It was a good plan. It needed more time than the situation allowed. And your plan required less time. My plan required a needle and 7 minutes. Thresh-Veloth looked at him with an expression that I couldn't entirely read. The Galvari face is structured differently enough from human that I've always found their expressions harder to parse than most species. But something in it, some quality of the focus, made me think he was doing the same calculation I'd done in the corridor. Running the numbers, working through what had actually happened, what the outcome would have been without the intervention. You understand, Thresh-Veloth said, that among my people what you did has a name. I don't, Marcus said. It is called Vel-Satra. The act of using your own hands to hold back the blood of another. He paused. It is a significant thing, not because it requires skill, though yours was clearly adequate, but because it requires the willingness to touch the wound, to be present with it. Most beings faced with a wound they cannot fully understand step back. He looked at Marcus steadily. You stepped forward. Marcus was quiet for a moment. I was a medic, he finally said. Stepping forward is what medics do. Yes, Thresh-Veloth said, it is. Another silence. I would ask your name, Thresh-Veloth said. Your full name, I would like to have it properly. Marcus Hale, Sergeant, Helix 9 Security. Thresh-Veloth nodded slowly. Marcus Hale, he repeated, like he was committing it to something, not just memory, something more formal than that. I will remember it. Word travels on a station the size of Helix 9 the way rumor travels everywhere. Faster than it should, transformed in the telling, and impossible to stop once it starts moving. By the evening of the incident, everyone on the station knew some version of what had happened. By the following morning, most of them had a version that was reasonably close to accurate, which is better than these things usually go. By the end of the week, We had received 3 separate information requests from coalition medical journals asking to document the VSS case and the mechanical closure intervention. Soren agreed to all 3. She wrote the case documentation herself in her precise and exhaustive style, and included detailed notes on the suture technique, the thread gauge, the needle angle, and the outcome metrics. She listed Marcus Hale as a contributing medical practitioner. He found out when she sent him a copy of the documentation for review. He came to find me afterward. I was back in the xenobiology lab, finally back to my silicon-adjacent culture samples, when he knocked on the door frame. I looked up. He was holding a data pad. He looked slightly bewildered, not dramatically, but in the subtle way that people look when something has moved them and they haven't yet decided what to do with that feeling. "She listed me as a contributing practitioner," he said. "I know. I'm not a practitioner. I'm security. Tell that to Commander Thresh Veloth's vital signs." He looked at the data pad, then at me, then back at the data pad. He paused. "There's a section in the documentation, recommendations. She's recommending that coalition medical stations in the Outer Rim maintain a field medicine reserve kit in their emergency supplies. Old-school suture materials, thread, needle, basic mechanical closure equipment, for situations where advanced systems are unavailable or insufficient." He said this with the careful tone of someone reporting a thing he can't quite believe. I thought about Soren, about her 4 eyes and her systematic mind and her comprehensive loathing of uncertainty. About the fact that she had just written a formal recommendation into a coalition medical record that Outer Rim stations keep thread and needles in their emergency supplies because of what she'd witnessed. "It makes sense," I said. "It works when everything else doesn't." "She's been doing coalition medicine for 40 years, Marcus said. "And you gave her a data point she didn't have," I said. "She's a scientist, she updates." He stood in the doorway for another moment, looking at the data pad. Then very quietly, almost to himself, 4,000 years. "What?" "The suture. I told Veloth we've had it for about 4,000 years. He set the data pad down on the nearest counter. "I've used it dozens of times, mostly humans, a few others during the border tour. Never thought about how old it was while I was using it." He paused. "It's a strange thing to have a skill that nobody in the coalition needs anymore, and then suddenly need it." I looked at him. "That's what being a medic is," I said. "You carry the knowledge because you don't get to choose when it becomes necessary." He thought about that. "Yeah," he said finally, "that's about right." 3 weeks after the incident, a formal communication arrived at Helix 9 from the CGS Iron Hello. It was addressed to the station commander, to Physician Soren Ethis, and to Sergeant Marcus Hale. Commander Thresh Veloth had submitted a formal citation through Galvari Military Command, recognizing Marcus's intervention. This was, according to the station commander, a Threnari named Director Oveth, who handled administrative affairs with the careful deliberateness of someone who had learned that anything unusual required careful deliberateness, an exceptional and rarely awarded recognition. The Galvari military offered formal citations to non-Galvari personnel perhaps a handful of times in a decade. They were taken seriously. The citation would be added to Marcus's official service record. Marcus received this news with approximately the same quiet, unmoved equanimity with which he received most things. He thanked Director Oveth. He thanked Soren, who looked at him with those 4 steady eyes, and said, "The recognition is appropriate," in a tone that managed to convey both approval and the suggestion that this was a topic she considered closed. Then he went back to his security rounds. I caught him in the cafeteria that evening. He was at his usual corner table with his coffee, real ground coffee, carefully rationed, and one of his paper books, and he looked up when I sat down across from him. "Congratulations," I said. He made a sound that wasn't quite dismissive, but wasn't quite accepting either. "It's a piece of paper," he said. "It's a Galvari military citation. Those are serious." "I know what they are." He turned a page of the book. "Commander Veloth would have made it without me. Soren would have found another way." "Maybe," I said, "but she didn't, you did." He looked at me over the edge of the book. His dark eyes had that quality again, that deep-water quality, the thing happening underneath that you could sense but not quite see. "I just did what I knew how to do," he said. "That's all." I thought about that for a moment, about what it means to do what you know how to do when everything around you is reaching for something more sophisticated, something more advanced, something calibrated to the specific parameters of the specific crisis. And all of those things are failing, and the only thing left is what you carry in your own hands. "Marcus," I said. He looked at me. "That's everything," I said. "That's literally everything." He considered that. Then he went back to his book. And I sat there with him in the quiet of the cafeteria, and through the panoramic viewport on the far wall, the Drevari cluster turned slowly in the dark, stars catching the light, ancient and enormous and completely indifferent, and the station hummed around us with the sound of 300 beings going about the business of staying alive. 6 weeks after the incident, something happened that I only found out about much later, not through the station gossip network, but through Soren herself, who mentioned it to me in the same direct, unembellished way she mentioned everything. She had requested a meeting with Marcus. Not a formal meeting, not in a professional capacity. A private meeting in her office at a time when neither of them had specific duties. She said she wanted to ask him something. I don't know the full content of that conversation. I only know what Soren chose to share with me later, which was selective. She has a very clear sense of what information is relevant to share and what isn't, and she applied it. But what she shared was this. She had asked him to explain field medicine to her. Specifically, Earth field medicine. The history of it, the development, the principles. She wanted to understand not just the techniques, but the philosophy, the set of assumptions that led Earth medicine to maintain and continue training in methods that, by the Coalition's assessment, were primitive to the point of obsolescence. Marcus had apparently thought about this for a moment, and then said, "Medicine in the field is about what you can do when you can't do what you'd prefer to do. The whole system is built around that assumption." Soren had pressed him. Most Coalition medicine, she pointed out, was built around the assumption of increasingly perfect tools. The trajectory was always toward more precision, more capability, more specificity. Redundancy was engineered in at every level. Why, she asked, would you also maintain training in the lowest capability methods when the redundancy systems should theoretically cover any gap? And Marcus had told her something that she repeated to me, word for word, because it had struck her as sufficiently significant to memorize. He said, because tools fail in patterns you can predict and plan for. Situations don't. Every time I've been in the field and something has gone wrong, it hasn't gone wrong in the way the contingency planning said it might. It's gone wrong in a completely unexpected way that nobody designed a backup system for because nobody imagined it. The only thing that's never failed me is basic knowledge that doesn't require anything except a working body and the willingness to use it. So we keep it. Not because we expect to need it, because we can't predict when we will. Soren had been quiet for a while after that, she told me, long enough that Marcus had apparently asked if he'd said something wrong. She'd told him, "No. You've said something I'm going to need to think about for some time." He'd accepted this with his characteristic equanimity. Then he'd asked if she wanted him to teach a basic field medicine seminar to the station staff. She'd said yes immediately. The seminar was scheduled for the following month. It ran 3 sessions, 2 hours each, with a combined attendance of 47 staff members from 12 different species. Marcus taught suturing technique on synthetic tissue models. He taught wound assessment. He taught pressure application, tourniquet principles adapted for multiple species, field triage prioritization. He taught it the way he did everything, quietly, directly, without flourish, with a steady competence that made the whole room feel more capable just by being in it. Soren attended all 3 sessions. She sat in the back and took meticulous notes. I should tell you what happened with the surgical bay. After the incident, Soren made changes. This was expected. She made changes after every significant event. That was how she operated. Every outcome was a data point, and every data point was an opportunity for system improvement. What was less expected was the nature of some of the changes. In addition to the new field medicine reserve kit, which appeared in the emergency supply cabinet within a week of the incident, a clear labeled case containing suture materials, basic wound closure tools, and an instruction card adapted for 14 different species tissue structures. Soren instituted something she called a methodology audit for every piece of emergency equipment on the station. The audit wasn't about capability, it was about failure modes. She wanted to know for every piece of equipment not just what it could do when it worked, but what happened when it didn't. And specifically, in the scenario where this equipment failed or was unavailable or was inappropriate for the patient's biology, what was the next option? And the one after that, and after that. She made the medical staff walk through those chains of options, out loud in teams, until everyone had thought seriously about the floor, the absolute lowest capability method available, the thing you could do when everything else was gone. It became a training standard on Helix 9. I believe it's still practiced there. I believe it's been adopted in modified form at several other coalition stations that received the case documentation. All because a security sergeant carried old knowledge in his hands. Marcus continued his security rounds. He continued rationing his coffee. He continued sending voice messages home to Lena every night. He continued reading his paper books. He continued being the quiet person in the corner who you might underestimate, until the moment when underestimating him was exactly the wrong thing to do. About 3 months after the incident, Lena sent him something. He showed it to me in the cafeteria, with the particular shy pride that I had come to recognize as the thing he felt about his daughter, and tried not to show too obviously. She'd made a drawing, a 9-year-old's drawing, crayon and marker on actual paper that she'd sent in a physical message packet, the kind that took weeks to transit through the mail system, but arrived as a tangible object rather than a file. In the drawing, there was a figure that was clearly meant to be her dad, black hair, dark uniform, slightly too large hands in the way that children draw hands when they're thinking hard about them. And the figure was standing next to what might have been an alien or might have been a large abstract shape. And the figure was doing something to the alien abstract shape with what appeared to be a needle and thread. Underneath, in the careful, determined writing of a child who has recently learned to write clearly, Daddy fixed the alien with sewing. Marcus looked at this drawing for a while. Then he folded it very carefully and put it in his jacket pocket. She heard the story, I asked. I told her, he said. She's at the age where she thinks everything is either disgusting or amazing. She landed on amazing. Smart kid. Gets it from her mother, he said, but he was smiling when he said it. I want to step back for a minute. I want to pull away from the story and talk about something that I've been thinking about ever since that afternoon. There's a tendency when you live in the future, and I do live in the future, relative to most of human history, in a station orbiting a cluster of stars with beings from 30 species, surrounded by technology that would have seemed like magic to 99% of every human who ever lived. There's a tendency to assume that what's new is better, that the upward trajectory of capability is also an upward trajectory of value, that the most advanced tool is the best tool, full stop. But Marcus Hale taught me something that I've been carrying with me ever since. The value of knowledge doesn't decay with the tool. The suture is 4,000 years old. The needle and thread, the act of closing a wound with your own hands, feeling the resistance of the tissue, adjusting the tension, making the judgment calls that come from experience rather than from a calibrated algorithm. The coalition has had interstellar travel for 300 years. It has had molecular tissue regeneration for 200. It has had diagnostic arrays that can read 400 biological variables simultaneously for 80 years. All of that capability is extraordinary. All of it represents genuine advancement. But none of it replaced the suture. It just made the suture seem unnecessary. And the difference between unnecessary and irrelevant is one emergency in an emergency bay on a station in the Drevari cluster, with a patient bleeding out and a system that wasn't designed for this specific failure mode. In that gap, in that precise, terrifying gap, old knowledge doesn't just remain relevant. It becomes everything. I think about the other Galvari officers on the Iron Hello who heard about what happened. I think about what it means for beings from cultures with different medical traditions to witness something like this, to see a technology gap, a failure mode they hadn't anticipated, and watch it be bridged by something so old it has no technological component whatsoever. There's a word I keep coming back to, robustness. The most advanced systems are often the most brittle in specific failure modes, because they're optimized for normal operation, and the optimization process removes redundancy that seems wasteful. The most primitive systems are often the most robust, because they have no dependencies, no power requirements, no calibration needs, nothing that can fail in the ways that sophisticated components fail. A needle and thread doesn't require power. It doesn't require calibration. It doesn't require biological compatibility data. It requires a steady hand and someone who has practiced enough to be effective. 4,000 years of practice. That's what Marcus Hale brought into that surgical bay. Let me tell you one more thing, and then I'll let the story rest. About 4 months after the incident, Helix 9 received a new staff member, a Galvari physician, the first Galvari medical staff we'd ever had on a Coalition Outer Rim station, which was historically unusual because Galvari medicine and Coalition medicine had enough structural differences that cross-certification was rare. Her name was Velsari Thanath. She was a specialist in Galvari cardiovascular conditions, with a secondary focus on cross-species trauma medicine. She was quiet and deliberate and startlingly direct, in the way that Galvari tend to be, and she brought with her a set of equipment cases that included instruments I'd never seen before. When I asked her why she'd specifically requested posting at Helix 9, rather than one of the larger, better-equipped stations in the inner clusters, she said something I didn't expect. "Commander Thresh Veloth recommended this station specifically," she said. "He told me that the staff here had an unusual quality. He described it as," she paused, working through the translation, "the willingness to touch the wound." I looked at her. "He said he wanted to work with people who had that quality," she said. "He believes it is becoming rare, in Galvari medicine as much as anywhere." I thought about Marcus, about the corridor outside the emergency bay, about the 1 second I stood there before I pushed through the door. "It's not rare," I said. "I think it's just quiet people have it. They don't always know when they're supposed to use it." Velsari Thanath considered this. "Perhaps," she said. She went on to become one of the most valuable staff members we had. Her knowledge of Galvari biology filled gaps in our understanding that we hadn't even known were gaps. She and Soren developed a professional relationship that, while never warm in any conventional sense, had a quality of mutual respect so deep it was almost visible. She learned the field medicine suturing technique in Marcus's second seminar session. She practiced it on the synthetic tissue models with the same focused seriousness she brought to everything. She told Marcus afterward that in Galvari field medicine there was a similar technique, older even than the Coalition, developed in the Galvari's early centuries of conflict. It had been deprecated from standard training 3 generations ago. Marcus told her she should bring it back. She said she was considering it. "I've been thinking these past months about what I would call the quiet ones. Not quiet in the sense of timid or absent. Quiet in the sense of Marcus Hale in the corridor. Present, observing, carrying more than they show, and waiting, not with impatience, but with a kind of patient certainty, for the moment when what they carry becomes necessary. In the Coalition, humans have a reputation that doesn't always do them justice. We're seen as loud, emotionally excessive, biologically strange, too warm, too reactive, too prone to making decisions that don't map cleanly onto any rational framework. And sometimes that's accurate. I won't pretend humans are always easy to be around. We're a complicated species. We come with a lot. But there's something else that comes with us. Something that lives in the same space as all that noise and emotion and biological excess. Something that grows from it, maybe. We carry things. We carry old knowledge that we've held onto past the point where it seemed necessary, because something in us, some deep, instinctive, 4,000-year-old part of us, knows that unnecessary is not the same as irrelevant. We carry grief and love and old stories, and practice skills that the universe has moved on from. And then the universe turns around and needs exactly those things. Marcus Hale was a security sergeant on a medium-sized medical station in the Outer Rim. He was not the highest-ranking, the most credentialed, the most technologically advanced person on that station. He was just a man with dark eyes and careful hands and old knowledge that had never stopped being true. In the gap between what the system could do and what the situation needed, that was enough. That was everything. Commander Thresh Veloth made a full recovery. He returned to duty on the Iron Hollow 6 weeks after the incident. Before he left Helix 9, He stopped at the security desk where Marcus happened to be running an access audit. He stood there for a moment, large and amber-plated and precise, looking at Marcus with those expression I still couldn't entirely read. He placed his right hand, the Galvari saluting gesture, palm forward, fingers together, held still for 3 counted seconds in front of Marcus. It was a military salute, the kind that, in Galvari culture, you offer to someone who has served with distinction. He held it for 3 seconds. Marcus returned it, not with the Galvari gesture, but with the Earth Defense Corps salute he'd learned during his tour, hand flat to his brow, equally precise, equally steady. They looked at each other across the security desk. Then Thresh Veloth lowered his hand, nodded once, and walked back to his ship. Marcus watched him go. Then he turned back to his access audit and kept working. The emergency bay was quiet that evening. I stopped in on my way to the lab, habit more than necessity. The equipment was in its normal configuration. The supply cabinet was stocked. The regeneration tank hummed at standby temperature. The field medicine kit sat in its corner of the supply cabinet, labeled clearly in 17 languages. Mechanical closure emergency kit, for use when primary systems are unavailable or incompatible. A needle, thread, basic instruments, old knowledge boxed and labeled and ready. I stood there for a moment looking at it. Then I went back to my work. 4 months, 2 weeks after the incident, Marcus received a voice message from Lena that was longer than usual. He mentioned it to me the next morning, which he didn't always do. Most of her messages were private, deeply private, the way anything connected to her was private. But this one he brought up. She'd apparently been doing a school project. Something about historical medical practices, the kind of project that 9-year-olds get assigned when their teachers are trying to connect old knowledge to the present in a way that feels relevant. And in the course of doing this project, she'd learned about surgical sutures, their history, their development, how long humans had been using them. And she'd sent him a voice message asking, "Daddy, if people have known how to do this for 4,000 years, why did the aliens not know about it?" He said he'd sat with that message for a while before responding. He'd thought about how to answer it in a way that was honest, but also appropriate for a 9-year-old. In a way that didn't just say, because they're more advanced, and also didn't say, because they thought they didn't need to know, in a tone that made that sound like a criticism. What he'd finally said to her, and he told me the specific words because I asked, was this. Because, Bug, when you get very good at doing something the new way, sometimes you stop practicing the old way, and most of the time that's fine because the new way is better. But sometimes, not often, just sometimes, you run into a situation where the new way doesn't work. And then the old way is the only way, and if you've stopped practicing it, you don't have it anymore. A pause. So I think the lesson is, don't stop practicing things just because they seem old. Lena had been quiet for a moment on the message. Then she'd said, "Like how Grandma still makes bread even though we can just print it." He'd laughed a real laugh, the kind he didn't do often enough. "Exactly like that," he'd said. "Exactly like that." I've thought about that exchange more times than I can count. I've thought about it in the lab, running analyses on cellular samples from species I've never even seen in person. I've thought about it during rounds, watching Soren move through the wards with that precise, four-eyed assessment of everything. I've thought about it at the viewport, watching the Drevari cluster turn in the dark. Bread that you can print, wounds that you can close with sound waves and precision lasers, blood that can be stopped with synthesized coagulants calibrated to the molecular level. All of it extraordinary, all of it true advancement. And somewhere inside it all, underneath the capability and the calibration and the algorithmic precision, there needs to be someone who still knows the old thing, who carries it in their hands, who doesn't stop practicing. Not as a fallback, not as a quaint tradition, as a necessity, as the floor that everything else stands on even when you can't see it. Even when you hope you'll never need it. Even when you know you might. I changed something about my own work after that afternoon. Not dramatically, not in a way that anyone else would necessarily notice, but I changed it. I started keeping a manual lab journal alongside my digital records. Pen on paper, an actual physical pen, which I had to order from the station supply, and which arrived looking slightly absurd in the context of the xenobiology lab. This small, simple, ancient instrument sitting next to equipment that could analyze the molecular composition of a cellular sample in under 30 seconds. I started writing down not just the results of my analyses, but the reasoning, the process, the steps I took to get from the question to the answer. Because digital records store the result, but if you're recording the reasoning, you have to actually know it, not just store it, but carry it, in your mind, in the motion of the writing. I don't know if I'll ever need it. I don't know if the moment will come when the digital systems fail, or are unavailable or simply insufficient, and I'll need to work from what I know rather than what I can look up. But I'm practicing, because Marcus Hale taught me something I should have already known, and probably did know somewhere deep down, in the same place that 4,000-year-old knowledge lives in all of us. The gap can appear at any time. You don't get to choose when. All you get to choose is whether you're ready. The stars don't care about any of this. The Drevari cluster doesn't know about the emergency bay on Helix 9, or about the black Velserath blood that pooled on the table and then stopped pooling, or about the 14 sutures placed with a curved needle and thread older than space travel. The cluster just turns, slow and enormous and entirely indifferent, burning through its nuclear fuel with the patient extravagance of something that has billions of years to work with. But inside one silver station floating at its edge, a field medicine kit sits in a supply cabinet with a label in 17 languages. A Velkari physician has modified 3 emergency protocols to include mechanical closure options. A Galvari medical officer is teaching an old technique that was deprecated 3 generations ago. A security sergeant sends voice messages to his daughter every night, tells her stories about the times when old things turned out to still matter, and she listens from however many light years away, probably in her pajamas, probably with a book about fish nearby. And the station hums, and the work continues. And somewhere in the quiet of all that motion and noise and biological excess, and ancient knowledge, and new technology and 30 species going about the business of staying alive together, somewhere in all of that, something very old is still working. Thread and needle, hands that know what to do, and the willingness to touch the wound.